The air above Oslo had been thick and still, the oppressive heat of mid-July clinging to the capital's stone and glass. Then, the silence fractured. It was a sound that defied description, too heavy to be thunder, too absolute to be construction. A dense shockwave, tasting of pulverized concrete and burning oil, swept through the government quarter. Within minutes, the city's meticulously organized emergency response dissolved into desperate scramble, a procedural mechanism overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the calculated violation. Chief Constable Arne Johannesson, 20 miles outside the city, felt the seismic shift in the nation's security through the crackle of his radio. The initial reports were maddeningly fragmented: a deliberate attack, a vehicle improvised into a weapon, casualties mounting instantly. The focus of every available unit locked onto the downtown disaster, stripping the outlying districts of resources just as the true, chilling extent of the plan began to unfold. The first faint, confused call came from the island of Utøya, a small forested sanctuary traditionally dedicated to youth and idealism. The lake, Tyrifjorden, usually reflected the summer sky in placid indifference, but now it was absorbing screams. A man, dressed convincingly in the familiar dark blue of the National Police Service, was moving methodically through the dense undergrowth, the rhythmic discharge of his rifle cutting through the pastoral calm. Johannesson's internal clock, usually steady and methodical, began to run backward. He understood instantly the devastating psychological weight of the disguise, the betrayal of trust, the elimination of the very concept of refuge. His small team, regional officers accustomed to petty crime and traffic accidents, were the closest available responders. Specialized tactical units, trapped by distance and the massive logistical snarl created by the Oslo bombing, were at least an hour away. The delay was measured not in minutes, but in lives extinguished. The procedural gap was gaping. They possessed no fast boat adequate for a tactical insertion, no heavy body armor designed to withstand sustained fire, and only standard-issue sidearms. Protocol screamed for patience, for waiting for backup, for securing a perimeter. But the sound of gunfire, carried faintly across the expanse of water, was a constant, searing counter-argument. Each report felt like a direct indictment of their inaction. The launch site was frantic, chaos muffled by the urgency of impending action. Civilians, desperate parents, and local boat owners were converging, their anguish thick and palpable. Johannesson focused only on the water. The lake, cold and dark beneath the surface, represented the final barrier between civilized order and sheer, remorseless malice. The small, borrowed Zodiac boat was dangerously slow, pitching awkwardly in the mild chop, completely exposed. He looked at the faces of his officers, young, grim, their training barely covering this level of combat exposure. They knew they were sailing directly into an active killing field, outgunned and outnumbered by a single, determined psychopath. This was not policing. It was a desperate, immediate rescue attempt masked as an intervention. The mission was not merely to stop the violence, but to bridge the terrifying gulf of isolation that had trapped the victims on that small, vulnerable patch of land. The island grew larger in their sight, shrouded in smoke and the heavy silence that follows extreme violence, waiting like a terrible, open maw. The investigation, the justice, and the analysis would come later. Now there was only the cold, unyielding imperative of the present moment. The boat scraped against the muddy bank. The immediate scent was metallic, coppery, overlaid with pine needles and damp earth. Johannesson stepped onto the island, the ground beneath his boots soaked in dread, carrying the full weight of the nation's sudden, incomprehensible fragility. The small group of officers moved inland instantly, the transition from open water to dense, wooded terrain a sharp psychological shock. The immediate priority was triage, silencing the threat, then searching for survivors among the terrifying stillness. The lack of resistance was initially confusing, then profoundly alarming. The methodical shots had ceased. The killer had either gone deeper into the woods or was waiting. The scene revealed itself in horrific, fragmented glimpses: a discarded cell phone, sneakers abandoned in the haste of flight, trails leading into the dense thicket. Every standard procedural rule, secure the perimeter, wait for specialists, maintain cover, was ignored. They were operating on instinct and duty. The silence was heavier than any barrage of gunfire, a vacuum pregnant with untold tragedy. Johannesson deployed his meager force in 2 pairs, maintaining only loose radio contact. Their mission quickly shifted from confrontation to discovery, mapping the extent of the disaster. They encountered the first witnesses, traumatized young people emerging from hiding places, their eyes wide with incomprehension and shock. Their hushed accounts confirmed the chilling efficiency of the perpetrator: the uniform, the calm demeanor, the systematic nature of the executions. The initial forensic analysis, conducted by the officers themselves under duress, focused on identifying movement patterns. The killer had used the island's natural contours and buildings strategically. The bodies lay scattered across various points: the main meeting house, the shoreline, the small footpaths, testimony to a prolonged and calculated hunt. The officers began marking evidence with whatever they had: cables, bits of bright cloth, knowing that a proper forensic sweep would require dozens of specialists and days of painstaking work. The first solid confirmation came near the small cafe building: a figure, heavily armed, moving away from the shore. The uniform was identical to their own, a deliberate taunt against the very notion of authority. Johannesson, relying on years of situational awareness, recognized the posture, not one of fear, but of conclusion. The operation was over. The killer, saturated in his own depravity, was awaiting arrest. The confrontation was immediate and brief, the suspect dropping his weapon and raising his hands, his expression eerily neutral, almost satisfied. The investigation had begun even before the full atrocity had been fully measured. The capture was a procedural necessity, but the true burden, understanding the motive and the scale of the horror, was only just beginning. Back on the mainland, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Special branch officers, delayed but now arriving in force, took custody of the perpetrator. The immediate handling of the killer was a textbook exercise in restraint and documentation, every word, gesture, and physical movement logged. He offered no resistance, only cryptic statements about ideology and retribution, which were immediately flagged for psychological assessment. Meanwhile, the island transformed into a massive, agonizing crime scene. The National Criminal Investigation Service deployed hundreds of personnel. Helicopters hovered overhead, illuminating the woods for search teams looking for the missing, both survivors and the deceased. The focus shifted to meticulous evidence recovery, mapping ballistic trajectories, cataloging spent casings, recovering personal effects, and, most cruelly, identifying the victims. Forensic teams worked through the night, battling the humidity and the psychological toll of the massacre. Every bullet hole was a data point, every footprint a lead. The investigation quickly established the killer's elaborate planning, the specific choice of weapons and ammunition for maximum lethality, the detailed surveillance of the youth camp, and the synchronized timing with the Oslo attack designed to ensure maximum police delay. Johannesson and his core team, though technically relieved of command, remained essential to the process, providing crucial contextual information about the initial minutes of the response. Their testimony became critical in reconstructing the killer's timeline, establishing that he operated unimpeded for well over an hour before their arrival. The investigation was not just about the capture, but a rigorous, painful self-examination of the systemic vulnerabilities exposed by the attack. The interrogation of the detained suspect commenced under high security in Oslo. The procedural challenge was immediate and profound, dealing with a subject who not only confessed freely but actively attempted to use the platform to articulate a detailed, anti-democratic manifesto. Detectives specializing in extremism and counter-terrorism led the questioning, focusing relentlessly on motive, possible accomplices, and the logistics of the two coordinated attacks. The evidence from the Oslo bombing site provided the first clear link. Forensic traces confirming the construction and deployment of the improvised explosive device. Surveillance footage pieced together his movements in the days leading up to the attack, revealing a calculated, solitary figure moving through the capital unnoticed, blending into the routine of city life. The sheer absence of genuine external support suggested an operation meticulously planned and executed by one man, amplifying the horror of its success. Investigators meticulously traced his digital footprint. Online manifestos, encrypted communications, and radicalized forum activity painted a picture of years of escalating ideological fervor, culminating in the detailed preparation of the attack. This digital landscape became crucial in understanding his psychological state and establishing premeditation beyond any doubt. The police had to navigate a difficult line, recording the killer's political rants for context while refusing to dignify them, ensuring the integrity of the judicial process. A major breakthrough arrived not through testimony, but through the detailed analysis of the recovered firearms and ammunition found on Utøya. The weapons were traced back through a legal acquisition process, purchased under the guise of sports shooting, but then illegally modified. More significantly, forensic analysts discovered unique chemical residue on a specific cache of ammunition, a compound often associated with a highly specialized, non-military industrial source. This trace element led detectives far from the ideological rhetoric and into the realm of logistics. The investigation pivoted to supply chains and niche distributors. The detectives focused on a small, regional logistics company near the killer's home, a company that handled hazardous materials for specialized manufacturing. The owner of the company, a man named Erik Halvorsen, initially appeared cooperative, but his alibi for the dates leading up to the attack was flimsy, reliant only on his own unverified testimony. Detectives observed subtle indicators of deception, micro-expressions of fear, an unnatural eagerness to please, and conflicting details about inventory. Halvorsen was not an ideological extremist, but a man drowning in personal debt, susceptible to exploitation. The pressure mounted. Detectives realized that if Halvorsen was connected, his role was likely logistical, providing access, transport, or storage, not ideological participation. They leveraged the financial desperation, presenting irrefutable evidence of large, recent cash deposits into his dormant accounts. The threat of accessory charges, coupled with the revelation of his financial ruin, proved the fulcrum. Halvorsen broke, revealing a limited but critical involvement. He had provided secure storage and access to a restricted industrial loading dock near the ferry terminal used for Utøya, facilitating the transport of the heavy equipment and ammunition in the days before the attack, disguised as routine supply deliveries. He confirmed the killer had acted alone in the planning and execution, but his unwitting facilitation had been instrumental. He had been paid handsomely and, until the explosions, believed the transaction was merely illicit trade, not terrorism. The revelation provided a crucial closure to the logistics puzzle, confirming the killer's meticulous planning and confirming the absence of a wider cell. However, the emotional toll on the investigative team was immense. The knowledge that a simple act of greed, an ethical failure by a third party, had smoothed the path for such massive carnage, deepened the sense of societal breach. Johannesson, sitting in the observation room as Halvorsen was formally processed, felt the procedural victory tinged with profound weariness. Justice was being served, systematically and meticulously, but the cost was staggering. The sheer volume of evidence, the hundreds of forensic reports, the thousands of hours of interview transcripts, all pointed to the same cold, desolate truth. Society had failed to recognize the danger lurking within. Months later, the courtroom became the stage for the formal, judicial reckoning. The killer sat impassively, continuing his political theatrics, but the police and prosecution presented a mountain of incontrovertible evidence. The narrative of the investigation, from the chaos of the immediate response to the tracing of the unique ammunition residue, was laid out with chilling precision. Johannesson and his team testified about the immediate, terrifying moments on the island, focusing on the sheer bravery required to confront the threat with inadequate resources. Their testimony anchored the prosecution's case not only in the facts of the murders but in the courage of the response. The judicial process, deliberately slow, measured, and focused on democratic principles, stood as the ultimate repudiation of the violence. The conviction was absolute, securing the maximum possible sentence. The closure was professional, but the personal scars remained deep. Johannesson stood on the mainland, gazing across the now tranquil water to Utøya. The island was quiet, the site slowly transforming into a memorial. He reflected on the faces of his young officers, forever marked by the atrocities they witnessed and the moral burden they carried. They had faced the unimaginable and, with minimal resource, had restored a semblance of order. The case files were sealed, the formal reports finalized, but the chilling realization persisted. Procedural rigor and heroic response could mitigate tragedy, but they could not erase the vulnerability inherent in a free and open society. The water of the fjord, reflecting the setting sun, held the memory of the day the nation learned that true danger often wore the mask of familiarity. The silence that now enveloped the island was not peace, but a permanent, cautious quiet, a constant reminder of the vigilance required to protect fragile democratic ideals from the darkness of extremism. In the subsequent season, long after the final verdict offered judicial resolution, the focus of the capital shifted inward. A specially convened Police Accountability Commission initiated an exhaustive inquiry, meticulously dissecting every procedural decision made during those harrowing hours. Chief Constable Johannesson found himself not in a heroic spotlight, but seated beneath the relentless glare of professional scrutiny. The central line of questioning revolved entirely around inertia, the critical, unforgiving time lag between the detection of the initial threat and the tactical counter-response. Every minute was weighed, every resource deployment analyzed against the stark calculus of lives lost, creating a pervasive sense of temporal guilt that settled over the entire regional command structure. Yet, the closure proved fleeting. The Commission's final report was not simply a critique. It was a blueprint for a profound organizational restructuring. The immediate failure, the document concluded, was systemic, rooted in obsolete communication infrastructure and a lack of dedicated rapid response assets in peripheral zones. Consequently, the national security mandate shifted, resulting in an unprecedented disbursement of funds earmarked solely for preemptive capacity. Regional headquarters were equipped with high-performance interceptor craft, permanently fueled and crewed, capable of extreme speed across variable water conditions, specifically designed to eliminate the reliance on civilian assistance or slow, standard patrol launches. Furthermore, training protocols underwent a fundamental paradigm shift. Previous emphasis on de-escalation yielded ground to a renewed focus on immediate, decisive lethal response to active assailant scenarios. New simulation facilities were constructed, utilizing cutting-edge virtual reality environments to drill officers on split-second decision-making under conditions of total information blackout and psychological duress. The objective was the cultivation of acute temporal efficiency, the ability to transition from passive readiness to aggressive intervention in mere seconds, drastically shortening the decision cycle that had proven so fatal during the attack. Beyond the mechanical upgrades, another crucial layer was added: forensic behavioral analysis integrated directly into regional policing. Specialized intelligence cells were established to monitor the digital detritus of ideological extremism, utilizing advanced algorithmic profiling to flag nascent threats before they manifested physically. This required officers to develop a new kind of acuity, moving beyond traditional crime detection to engage in the nebulous, often frustrating domain of predictive security. They were now tasked with discerning the physical intent hidden within torrents of online rhetoric, balancing civil liberty against the necessity of preemptive engagement. Conversely, this hardening of the security apparatus introduced an internal friction. The shift toward a militarized mindset fundamentally altered the ethos of community policing. Officers trained for swift, decisive confrontation found the gentler nuances of local service increasingly difficult to maintain. The heavy, protective layers of modern response gear became a symbolic barrier, insulating the police force from the very communities they were sworn to protect. The lingering legacy of the island was therefore dual-edged. The systems were vastly more capable of confronting violence, but the perceived distance between the state and its citizens had subtly widened. The new speed and technological capability, while saving future minutes, had cost them something intangible: the unburdened trust of a safer era. The systematic demolition of an attack's logistics yielded a forensic victory, yet the resultant clarity offered no moral comfort. The relentless inquiry into the temporal lag exposed the fundamental flaw, not of malice but of institutional design. The machinery of state security, built for measured response and gradual escalation, proved fatally brittle when confronted with an instantaneous, two-pronged assault. The subsequent effort, the immense, painstaking work of tracing obscure industrial compound residues and auditing dormant financial accounts, only served to highlight how easily meticulous, concentrated evil can exploit the mundane vulnerabilities of an unsuspecting, decentralized democracy. This procedural triumph, however complete in a legal sense, cast a long, unsettling shadow over the very structures it was meant to vindicate. The immediate, almost desperate influx of resource acquisition, a defensive reflex measured in high-performance hull design and advanced sensor arrays, signaled a national trauma shifting its shape into hardened capability. The investment was not merely in equipment, but in the eradication of that terrible, unforgiving delay. Time itself became the enemy, a precious, finite commodity that must never again be ceded to an antagonist. The system now operated under the perpetual mandate of minimizing the moment between detection and decisive intervention, an operational shift that fundamentally re-scripted the duties of the regional constable. Reflecting on this journey so far, one sees the law enforcement community standing at a paradoxical crossroad. They are now faster, more resilient, and equipped to confront threats that materialize without warning, yet the psychological cost is evident in the new distance they maintain. The introduction of advanced threat modeling and continuous digital surveillance required a necessary detachment, forcing officers to view their environment not through the lens of neighborly trust, but as a mosaic of potential threat vectors. This constant state of heightened, anticipatory vigilance became a permanent fixture, an unseen armor plating their interactions, subtly eroding the previous organic harmony between the uniform and the street corner. The procedural success, therefore, carried an invisible fee, a diminished capacity for simple, unburdened public engagement. The air remains heavy with the realization that the deepest threat did not cross a border. It festered in the ideological fringes, meticulously planned within the very framework of domestic stability. This acknowledgement shattered the comforting illusion of externalized danger, forcing a painful internal calibration. The justice served, absolute and legally sound, did not fully capture the corrosive nature of the betrayal of trust inherent in the killer's calculated disguise. The investigation concluded the chapter of accountability, sealing the physical evidence and charting the criminal journey from inception to conviction, but the reverberations continued, echoing in the quiet spaces of every police precinct and government corridor. The meticulous reconstruction of events, from the explosion's shockwave to the final, chilling moment of surrender on the island's shore, now rests as a definitive historical ledger. It is a record not only of brutality but of institutional learning forged in fire. The narrative has moved past the initial shock and the immediate pursuit. It has settled into the complex, enduring aftermath where the true measure of a society is taken, not by how swiftly it captures the perpetrator, but by how profoundly it permits that experience to redefine its commitment to both security and liberty. We are left contemplating the heavy, lingering residue of that darkness, preparing for the ultimate thematic reconciliation, where procedural resolution confronts the enduring questions of morality and the permanent scar etched upon the collective psyche. The conclusion of the rigorous judicial process provided a necessary legal framework, yet it failed to deliver true absolution. The meticulous work of tracing every ballistic fragment and every financial transaction affirmed the state's unwavering commitment to due process, but this procedural triumph was inherently cold. It quantified the disaster without alleviating the psychological cost. The investigation yielded clarity on the how and the who, but left the enduring, haunting residue of why hanging heavily in the northern air. The lasting message etched into the nation's security architecture was not simply one of retribution, but of painful, structural metamorphosis. The vast reforms implemented in the wake of the attacks, the specialized fast response vessels, the overhaul of communications, the emphasis on shrinking the response time, were tangible artifacts of a trauma translated into engineering. They represented an absolute refusal to let vulnerability define the future. For Chief Constable Johannesson and his peers, this new environment demanded perpetual, analytical vigilance. They were no longer simply custodians of order. They were analysts of intent, forced to constantly project threat scenarios and measure potential chaos against the current calm. The burden was immense. Guarding a free society while maintaining the integrity of that freedom, knowing that the greatest peril emerged from within its own boundaries. The most profound shift occurred not in hardware, but in the intangible sphere of trust. The killer's disguise, the deliberate adoption of the police uniform, had been a surgical strike against the nation's sense of security, transforming a symbol of protection into an instrument of terror. To counteract this institutional wound, the police gained strength and speed, but at the expense of a previous, unquestioning rapport with the public. The advanced threat assessment teams, focusing on the dark corners of the digital world, necessitated a constant, low-level intrusion into privacy, a trade-off accepted with a weary understanding. The procedural necessity of being hardened, prepared, and perpetually skeptical created a necessary, functional barrier between the force and the communities it served. Looking out over the fjord, Johannesson realized the nature of his team's enduring commitment. The water appeared serene, reflecting the distant mountains with deceptive tranquility, yet it concealed the depths of the recent tragedy and the preparedness that now lay coiled just beneath the surface. The courage shown by the first responders, navigating the lake under fire with woefully inadequate protection, became the moral compass for the entire national security effort. Their raw, immediate humanity in the face of absolute calculated malice proved that even when protocol failed, the core ethical imperative to protect life persisted. The legacy of the event was therefore not one of simple failure and recovery, but of complicated, ongoing resolve. The nation had responded to an act of barbaric ideological cruelty with an intensified dedication to democracy and systematic justice, choosing painstaking adherence to law over vengeful haste. This commitment to procedural rigor, however agonizingly slow, stood as the ultimate repudiation of the terrorists' nihilistic message. The shadow of Utøya would forever define the threshold of national readiness, a permanent, quiet reminder that vigilance is not merely a task, but the constant, necessary affirmation of the societal contract. The meticulous, weary work continued, securing the future not just through superior technology, but through an unwavering, deliberate commitment to moral integrity, ensuring the painful lessons learned on that small, tragic island would forever underpin the defense of the light.